Is the U.S. airspace actually going to shut down? Because that's been a pretty big talking point from Secretary Duffy, who's the Department of Transportation Secretary, over the last 24 hours. U.S. may be forced to close some airspace next week if government shutdown continues. What does that mean? Well, hello, if you're new, I'm Marcus. I'm an air traffic controller, and I'm trying to demystify air traffic control for pilots and normal people who just like aviation. Short answer to whether airspace will close is maybe. Here's a quick overview. There's three types of air traffic controllers. You have the tower controllers. They work in the tower, obviously. And they control the ground movement at an airport and the runways at an airport. So they're the guys that clear airplanes for takeoff and clear airplanes to land. And they control about a 5-mile ring around that airport, up to about 3,000 feet. Tower controllers are the most visible air traffic controller, but they control the least amount of airspace. The next type of air traffic controller is a terminal radar approach controller, or a TRACON controller. TRACON controllers work around a 50-mile ring around a main airport. So if this airport has a tower, there's the 5-mile ring, and then the TRACON controllers control everything around it up to 50 miles. To that main airport, the TRACON controller also runs arrivals and departures to satellite airports, so airports that are not the main airport. Satellite airports may have a tower or they may not have a tower. Here's the main airport, satellite, satellite, satellite. You get the picture. TRACONs normally control anywhere from the surface to 10,000 or surface to 16,000 feet, just depending on where they're located. And TRACONs control everything that's not controlled by a tower or airspace that's deemed uncontrolled. This is a map of all of the TRACONs, all those terminal radar approach controls within the United States. There's a lot of them. Now we get to what I do, which is a Air Route Traffic Control Center controller. So ARTCCs control airplanes in between airports at anything that's not considered a TRACON or a tower or uncontrolled airspace. So from the moment you push back at the gate to the moment that you arrive at the gate, you are talking to an air traffic controller. Zoom in on Denver real quick. Now these center airspaces are gigantic, so how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So they subdivide those centers into areas or into specialties or into sectors, and then airplanes fly between the sectors. Each sector is assigned a frequency and a radar controller. These sectors are not only divided laterally, but they're divided vertically as well. Those altitude stratifications also apply to TRACONs as well. Now let's zoom in on Atlanta. And if we look at the Atlanta airspace sideways, these are the layers of the cake of air route traffic control. You have some sectors that go to the surface up to like 10,000 feet, 11,000 feet to flight level 230, flight level 240 to flight level 330, then flight level 350 to above. And again, there's different sectors within those altitude stratums, and each of those sectors gets a frequency. Now multiply that stratification across the whole United States, and that's a lot of sectors and a lot of altitudes and a lot of frequencies. And a lot of controllers that are required to work without pay manning those sectors and frequencies. So what happens when an airspace closes? Let's take a look at Albuquerque. They had a fire alarm earlier this year, and they had to shut down the airspace. When that happens, all the aircraft are routed around that center airspace, which cause delays, cause higher fuel costs for airlines because now they have to fly longer to get around that airspace. And if you're trying to depart Albuquerque, the tower and the TRACON are okay, but you can't climb, you can't go anywhere once you get out of that TRACON 50-mile bubble. Most airlines require aircraft to fly IFR, which is a type of flight rule, which means that they have to look at their instruments. And a contingency to fly IFR is you have to be talking to air traffic control because we're providing separation from other airplanes, as opposed to flying VFR or visually, where the pilot is looking outside to separate airplanes from themselves. Back to our map, let's look at Kansas City. Kansas City lost all their frequencies earlier this year as well. So again, same thing, aircraft had to be routed around Kansas City. They still were flying if they weren't originating within the Kansas City RTEC, but it was just longer and a more circular route. It was still safe, but it was just longer. So now let's look at a hypothetical flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles if some of those center sectors had to close. If some of those altitude stratum sectors had to be closed because of staffing or because of weather or the combination of both. For those of you who are regular viewers, I post the National Airspace Ops Plan every day. And part of that Ops Plan is a national en route overview. So on this specific day, there is a playbook in effect for this weather over Dallas and north of Houston. A playbook meaning all aircraft flying between this airport and this airport are rerouted on this new route. It's not like the most efficient route, but it gets you around the weather or around sector saturation or around closed airspace. So we can see here a flight from Atlanta to LA should just go straight across, but there's a lot of weather here, so they're having to route south around that weather. So when Secretary Duffy says that they may have to close airspace, it's nothing new. We do this all the time, actually. You just don't know about it. If there's weather, airplanes don't like flying in this stuff, so they basically close the airspace to make airplanes have to go around that weather. What does closing airspace do? It means that there's now more air traffic volume, there's more airplanes being pushed south around that weather and then north, which means the sectors down here become oversaturated because there's more airplanes than there should be. So here's what that looks like on our end. Sector 70, Sector 20, well, this is an old map, Sector 68 is what this is now, is red. And that means that there's more airplanes than there should be within a given time period in these sectors. So in order to combat that, traffic volume is reduced and ground delay programs are initiated to hopefully help reduce the amount of aircraft volume flying within these sectors, because now everybody's flying through these sectors. Even though weather in Atlanta may be beautiful, weather in Los Angeles may be beautiful, you get a 3-hour delay in Atlanta. And you're like, why is that? Well, it's because there's so many airplanes flying around this weather, flying around closed airspace, that there's no room for your airplane to fly through this airspace yet. So when the FAA says they're reducing flights for safety, that's why. They're either going around weather, they're going around congested airspace, or they're trying not to make the airspace more congested than it already is. So all that to say, closed airspace is not the end of the world. Closing airspace is actually pretty routine. The media and the politicians are just using this as a way to stir up animosity and anxiety amongst the flying public to try and get their form of budget or their form of political prowess passed. Could airspace close because there aren't enough air traffic controllers? Yes. Does having a lack of air traffic control at a facility make that airspace less safe? Well, unless there's none, then no. Does a controller going to work who's distracted by how am I going to pay my mortgage or how am I going to buy food make the airspace less safe? Most of the controllers that I know would rather call in sick than show up to work fatigued and distracted and potentially have an error. And ultimately, that's why these airspaces would shut down, because controllers don't want to risk the safety of the national airspace system because they're distracted because of this government shutdown. Leave your thoughts and comments down below, and don't forget to follow for more.